There is a village that exists in the telling of this story and in the recognition of everyone who hears it. You will know this village. Not because you have been there, it has no coordinates on any map and no name in any atlas. But because you have lived in it. Because most of us have lived in it for longer than we realize, breathing its particular air, seeing through its particular light, measuring our days against its particular and quietly devastating standard of what is enough. The village has no walls and no gates and no guards at the entrance. It does not need them. It keeps its inhabitants inside not through force but through something more durable than force, through the simple, powerful, entirely internal architecture of a story they have all agreed, without quite deciding to agree, to tell about the world and their place in it. The story the village tells is this: there is not enough. There has never been enough. There will not be enough. What we have is insufficient, what we produce is inadequate, what the earth gives us is less than what we need, and the horizon holds no promise of change. This is not self-pity, in the village. It is not weakness. It is what everyone knows. It is the water they drink and the air they breathe and the first thought of the morning before any particular fact of the day has had a chance to complicate it. It is the story so old and so universal within the community that nobody can remember when it began or who first told it. It simply is. It is what is true. It is what has always been true. It is what will always be true. The village sat in a valley between two hills that were neither generous nor particularly harsh. The land produced what land tends to produce when worked with reasonable care, not abundance in the dramatic sense, not the rolling plenty of a promised land, but enough. Enough grain and enough vegetables and enough fruit and enough water from the stream that cut through the lower part of the valley to keep a community of reasonable size in reasonable health. This enough was not experienced as enough. It was experienced as almost not enough, and the almost was where the village lived, in the narrow and perpetually anxious space between what they had and what they feared they did not have. They compared with careful bitterness. The family on the eastern side of the valley had a slightly better positioned field. The family near the stream had easier access to water. The family at the base of the south-facing hill got more sun on their garden and their harvest showed it. Each household kept a precise and frequently updated account of what the others had that they did not, and what they had that the others did not, and the accounting was never in their own favor because the mind trained on scarcity is systematically better at counting deficits than surpluses and will continue to be so regardless of what the actual numbers show. The children grew up inside this. They absorbed it the way children absorb everything, without choosing to, without being taught it explicitly, simply by living in it until it became the texture of reality itself. They learned to want what others had. They learned that satisfaction was suspect, that a person who seemed content with what they had was either hiding something or missing something or both. They learned that the appropriate response to a good harvest was anxiety about whether next year's would be as good. They learned, in the particular and invisible way that all the most important things are learned, that the world was a place of scarcity and that the only rational response to scarcity was vigilance, comparison, and the maintenance of a low-grade but constant alertness to the possibility that someone else was doing better than you. The elder of the village was a woman named Myra. She was old enough that nobody knew quite how old she was, and she had been the elder long enough that the role had become inseparable from her person in the way that roles sometimes do when a person has grown into them so completely that you cannot imagine them apart. She was not dramatic. She was not a prophet or a performer. She was the kind of person whose authority derives not from declaration but from the consistent quality of their attention. The way they listen, the way they wait, the way they are always somehow already there when something important needs to be named. She had watched the village live inside its scarcity story for decades. She had watched good harvests fail to produce gratitude and bad harvests confirm the story that was already running. She had watched the comparing and the accounting and the low bitterness that accumulated in people who spend their energy measuring what they lack against what others have. She had watched children born into lightness gradually take on the particular weight of the story the community carried. The way young shoulders gradually take on loads that nobody chose for them but that everyone has normalized through years of bearing. She did not try to change the story through argument. She had lived long enough to know that stories as old and as deep as this one do not yield to argument, that telling a person their story of scarcity is wrong is simply absorbed by the story itself and filed as evidence that you do not understand, that you have not been paying attention, that you have not seen what they have seen. She was waiting for something else. She was waiting for a moment when the story might be interrupted not by a better argument but by a direct and undeniable experience of its alternative. The moment came in a summer of genuine hardship. The rains had been insufficient that year and the harvest was genuinely poor, not catastrophically so, not the starvation of the worst years in the village's memory, but poor enough that the anxiety that was always present became sharper, louder, more visible in the faces and the conversations and the daily encounters of people who were now experiencing not the imagined scarcity of the story but something closer to an actual one. Myra called a gathering. This was not unusual. She called gatherings when the community needed to be spoken to, and the community came when she called because they trusted her in the way that people trust someone who has never used their trust to gain advantage. They came in the evening, as the light cooled, gathering in the open space at the center of the village with a particular mixture of exhaustion and anxiety that a difficult season produces in people who were already anxious before the season was difficult. She did not speak immediately. She had placed, in the center of the gathering space, a long low table. On the table she had arranged the produce that was available in the village at that particular moment. Not the produce of any one household but contributions from all of them. Small amounts, nothing extravagant, nothing that any household could not reasonably spare. A few vegetables. Some grain. Some dried fruit from the autumn before. Some bread. The table was not full. It was not an impressive feast. But it was not nothing. She asked each person, as they arrived and found their place, to look at the table before they sat down. Not to assess it. Not to calculate whether it was adequate. To look at it. And to think, while they were looking, of the hands that had produced what they were looking at. The specific hands. The family who had grown the grain, who had prepared the soil and planted the seed and tended the growth through the difficult weeks and harvested what the difficult season allowed. The family who had dried the fruit, who had gathered it in the better autumn and preserved it through the winter with the knowledge and the labor that preservation requires. The family who had baked the bread. People looked. Some of them, in the looking, began to see something they had not been seeing. The produce on the table was not simply produce, objects that appeared, as objects tend to appear in a consumer relationship with the world, from some general and impersonal elsewhere. It was the result of specific human effort, specific care, specific knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned to work this particular land in this particular valley and had passed that learning to their children and their children's children. The grain existed because someone chose to plant it. The bread existed because someone chose to bake it. None of it was given. All of it was made. And the making of it had required from the makers something that was worth, before the eating of it, a moment of genuine acknowledgement. Myra spoke then. She said, and she said it quietly, without the rhetorical urgency of someone trying to convince people of something, simply and directly, as she said everything. Before we speak of what we do not have, let us name what we do. Not as a comfort. Not as a way of pretending the difficulty is not real. But because what we do have is also real, and has been earned by real effort and real care, and the people who produced it deserve to hear that their effort was seen. She asked each family to name one thing they were grateful for. Not in the abstract. Specifically. One thing that existed in their lives, this season, this year, this difficult and honestly insufficient year, that they were genuinely glad of. She was not asking for false brightness. She was not asking for the performed optimism of people who have decided that gratitude is a virtue and are demonstrating it accordingly. She was asking for honesty about what was real. And what was real, even in the difficult year, turned out to be more than the story of scarcity had allowed them to see. The first family spoke of their daughter, who had been ill the previous spring and had recovered. Not smoothly or easily. The recovery had taken months and had frightened them in ways they had not spoken of to anyone. But she had recovered. And she was here tonight. And this was not nothing. The second family spoke of the stream that had not dried, even in the insufficient rain of this summer. Of the water that had kept coming, reliable and cold, from the source further up the valley. Of the fact that they had water when they had needed it. That the stream had held. An old man spoke of his neighbor. Of the morning 2 months earlier when he had been too ill to tend his garden and his neighbor had appeared without being asked and had done the work and had not mentioned it afterward and had not expected acknowledgement, and this, said the old man, was the kind of person he was fortunate enough to live beside. A young woman spoke of the knowledge she carried. Of everything she knew about how to grow food in this valley, in this soil, with these particular challenges and these particular advantages. Of the fact that this knowledge had been given to her by people who had understood the land before her and had taken the time and the care to pass it on. That she was not starting from nothing. That she was standing on decades of accumulated understanding. That she had been handed, by the dead and by the living, the means to survive a difficult year. And that this was worth something. One by one the voices came. Some stumbled. Some found the words slowly, as if they were reaching for something that had been at the back of a drawer for a long time and needed to be brought to the light and dusted off before it could be used. Some found, in the speaking, that they were unexpectedly moved, not by sentimentality but by the direct impact of attention, of actually looking at the specific and particular gifts of a life they had been measuring entirely by its gaps. And something happened in the gathering. It was not dramatic. It was not the sudden transformation of a community from one way of being into another. Real change does not happen that way, and Myra had not expected it to. What happened was subtler and in some ways more significant than dramatic transformation. The air in the gathering shifted. The quality of the silence between the speakers changed. The faces of the people listening carried something different from the exhausted anxiety they had arrived with. Not joy, not relief, but something like recognition. The recognition of a world that was larger than the story of scarcity had allowed. The recognition of a life that contained, alongside its genuine difficulties and its genuine insufficiencies, a texture of gifts that had been present all along and had simply not been named. They ate together. The food on the table, the food that was not enough, that was less than what a full harvest would have provided, that was the product of a year that the scarcity story had correctly identified as hard, tasted different. Not because anything had changed in the food. Because something had changed in the tasters. Because they were eating with a quality of attention that acknowledged where the food had come from and what it had taken to produce it and what it meant that it was here, on this table, in front of people who were here, in this valley, alive and gathered and together. The village did not become a village of contentment overnight. The comparing did not stop immediately. The anxiety did not dissolve in a single evening. Human patterns as old and as deep as these do not dissolve in evenings. But something had been introduced that could not be fully introduced. A practice. A way of looking. The habit of naming what was real before naming what was absent. The understanding that scarcity and abundance are not simply facts about the world. They are, in significant part, ways of attending to the world, and the attending can be chosen, however difficult the choosing is. Myra began to end each gathering, from that evening forward, with the same invitation. Before we speak of what we do not have, let us name what we do. Not as a rule. Not as a performance. As a practice. As the deliberate cultivation of a different quality of attention toward the life they were actually living rather than the life they were comparing it to. The children noticed. Children always notice what the adults around them are actually doing, as opposed to what they say they are doing, and what the adults were doing differently after that gathering was looking. Actually looking at what was there. Actually speaking it out loud. Actually saying, in the presence of others, I am glad of this. I am glad this person is beside me. I am glad this stream kept flowing. I am glad I know what I know. I am glad we are here. The children grew up hearing this. And what children grow up hearing becomes, with time, what they believe to be true about the world. Not perfectly and not without complication. But enough. Enough to carry into their own lives a slightly different orientation toward what they had. Enough to feel, more often than their parents had felt it, the particular warmth of a world that was genuinely and specifically and nameably good to them, even when it was also genuinely and specifically and nameably hard. The table was set again every year after that. Not as a ceremony of abundance. The harvests were not always abundant, and the ceremony did not pretend they were. But as a ceremony of naming. Of looking with care at what was actually there, at who had made it and what it had cost them and what it meant that it was here. At the stream that kept coming. At the neighbor who appeared without being asked. At the knowledge carried in the hands of people who knew how to work a difficult land. At the children who had been ill and had recovered. At the old and the young gathered in the same space under the same sky at the end of the same difficult and irreplaceable day. It was not a cure. It was not a solution to the genuine challenges of a life lived in a valley between two hills with soil that did not always cooperate and rain that did not always come. It was something smaller and more durable than a solution. It was a way of seeing. A way of standing inside whatever was true, the abundance and the scarcity, the ease and the difficulty, the gifts and the gaps, and choosing, in the act of naming what was present, to receive what the world was actually offering before mourning what it was not. The table is still set. Somewhere in you, in the particular valley of your particular life, the table is still available to be set. The produce is on it, smaller than you wish in some years, more surprising than you expected in others, always the result of someone's specific effort and specific care and specific love. It is waiting to be looked at. Waiting to be named. Waiting for the moment before the meal when someone says, simply and honestly and with the full weight of their genuine attention, "I am glad of this," and means it. That is the whole ceremony. That is the whole village. That is the entire practice, available to anyone, in any valley, in any year, in any season of genuine difficulty or genuine plenty. Look at what is here. Name it. Mean it. And then eat together.